Hey class, welcome back to WH2 Session. I hope you're all doing well today. In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the first part of the interwar years, which is the years between World War I and World War II. Stay tuned for the PowerPoint.
Okay, class, we're going to be looking at the PowerPoint for the interwar period, which is the period after World War I to the beginning of World War II in 1939. So it'd be basically from 1919 to 1939 is considered the interwar period. We're not going to talk too much about the later interwar period of the later 1930s. We'll pick up more of that when we start talking about World War II and the beginning of World War II. But this is the interwar period. It was basically a time of post-war pessimism, but before the First World War, there was great optimism. The nations were doing really well. They built up large militaries. They had strong nationalism. They had strong governments, leaders. Things just looked really well in the countries that people were living in. They had a good outlook to the future, and it was very optimistic. But after World War I, that was all shattered, and we have a post-war pessimism where many things began to be questioned. Government was questioned. I mean, they followed their national governments. They followed them into 4 years of war that just completely destroyed nations and generations of young men, especially. But that affected young women and families. So after the war, it was just this time of questioning, of uncertainty. And so it's a time of post-war pessimism. There was a quote given by Gertrude Stein, who she was writing to Ernest Hemingway. Now, Hemingway is an author, and he actually fought in the First World War for the United States. But she writes this to Ernest Hemingway, quote, "You are all a lost generation." And that term, a lost generation, actually became a label for this time period. The Lost Generation was a label given to a group of intellectuals and poets that congregated in Paris after the war. But really what happened was that label went on to describe the post-war sentiment, describe the post-war, especially those people that had survived the war in their 20s. The soldiers had returned in their serving, and their ages were around in their 20s, and it just there was this idea of questioning and lostness. So they were the lost generation. It expressed the delusion that characterized the United States and European countries and their thought after the war. And so I put underlined there on the slide, so many went to war 4 years early, viewing it as a great adventure. They were going out there and fight for our country, for our king. We're going to be home by Christmas. We're going to defeat the enemy. We're going to, they called the Germans, they called them the Huns. We're going to go and defeat the Hun. But after this, returning from war, so many people were just thinking, what in the world was all of this for? They were pondering the suffering, the death, the meaninglessness of the war. Nothing really came out of all of this after the war. So there's this post-war pessimism. There were some post-war novels that helped to spread this disillusion. Now, at this time there was radio, there was some film. It was early radio. There was early films, mostly silent films, but early films. So to get information to spread, most people, it was in the newspapers, but also in novels. People would buy novels and read them as their interest and entertainment for the day. And there were two that were written, A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway, 1929, and All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Maria Remarque in 1929. And many of you may have seen these adaptations in film, especially All Quiet on the Western Front. In 1979, there was a version of the movie put out, All Quiet on the Western Front. And again, it just shows the soldiers in the war and just going through 4 years of war, and one by one they're dying, and it's just kind of like what was it all for? Most people lamented about the decline of society and that things would never be the same. So before the war, there was again this optimistic society. It was very structured by class, but it was like the people they got up, they lived their life, they had their family, they would go to work. And then after the war, it was just shattered. So many men were killed, husbands were killed. Some of especially the upper class, mom and dad in the upper class, maybe in their 40s and 50s, they had children that went to the war and never returned home. So you have these upper class children dying in the war. And these would be the heirs to these great estates. And now the heirs have been killed in the war. Some other things that take place in the culture, post-war science was changed, and I'm not going to get into too much into the science itself, but more of just the philosophy or the idea that came out of this post-war science discoveries. It affected people's thought, and it begins basically in 1905. Albert Einstein he discovers the theory of special relativity. It's one of the portions of the theory of relativity. There's special relativity. And what he said is basically space and time cannot be measured by absolutes and are relative to the person taking the measurements. So Einstein is basically saying when you're starting to think of this type of science with space and time, whenever you're taking some kind of a measurement, the space and time is always continuing. And so there's no absolute time that you can actually take a measurement for time, because time is even if you go down to the narrowest or smallest segment of time, for example, let's say for example the nanosecond, or what even smaller than that. Even you say I'm going to take that measurement now, time has already changed. So Einstein comes up with this theory, and it basically challenged the laws of science. And that will then have an effect here for what's coming up with this. It's called the uncertainty principle. The key word there being uncertainty. So you think of the time period we're in between the wars and how everyone's kind of disillusioned and they're pessimistic. And now you have this kind of law of science that's called the uncertainty principle. So even science is not even certain. So Werner Heisenberg, 1901 to 1976, he published a paper that it is impossible to simultaneously measure the position and velocity of a subatomic particle, which is basically the electron that he's talking about measuring. That it's impossible to do that. The closer you get to the closer that one gets to the measurement of an electron's position in the subatomic particle, the farther from the electron's measured velocity. Okay, so it affects this measurement and vice versa. So if you're measuring the velocity of electron, it's going to affect how the position of the electron. And so it's the uncertainty principle. There's Einstein. So you say, why in the world, Zach, is this even important for the interwar years? The uncertainty principle went beyond science, and it kind of made impact into the philosophical ramifications of thought. If things are so uncertain, then what happens when you start talking about truth? So really, it called into question the established notions of truth and violated the fundamental law of cause and effect. So just in a basic explanation of this, you had nations who developed treaties to prevent war, and that they would say, well, that's the truth. These treaties are going to help us stay away from war. But really, that wasn't the truth. The way these treaties were written up, it actually took them towards war. And it violated the fundamental law of cause and effect. So if you have a treaty that's going to prevent war, the effect is going to be no war. But what happened was you have the treaty establishing situations or instances where it could lead to war, which it did. So the effect then is millions of men dying, and the social structure is shattered in many of these countries. So there's just this the shattering of what people viewed as established truth. This uncertainty of truth then spilled over into many areas of life. So who can you trust? What the government says, are they telling you the truth? If you're going to war, are you going to be coming out of that war with this same mentality as when you went into the war? These were the things that they pondered and they questioned. Sigmund Freud, I put this under the science because it's really psychology, but Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, you may have heard of him. He really went deep into man's thought and developed a psychology that challenged the concepts of morality and values. And so again, if you start thinking about this uncertainty principle, you say, well, what is truth, and then what is moral? Well, is the established morality, is that unchangeable? Are these values unchangeable? And so what happens is during the interwar years, especially under Freud's psychoanalysis of people and his writings, it basically comes down to you start questioning these things, and things are explained away to where maybe it's not a value. He developed psychoanalysis that provided keys to understanding human behavior. I just wanted to throw that in there because you've probably heard of Sigmund Freud. There he is, well-known picture of him holding his cigar. Okay, so the post-war recovery is key to what takes place. Was basically going to lead up to the Second World War, because it's how they handle the economy that just really starts causing all kinds of problems with how the nations are getting back on their feet. But then obviously towards the end of the 1920s, you have the Great Depression. So the whole time period in regards to the economy is a complete shambles. Europe is near bankruptcy. Almost every country in Europe is in complete debt because of the war. They've depleted all of their reserves. They've depleted all of their resources, and they're nearing bankruptcy. 10 million men dead across Europe, 7 million permanently disabled. Notice I put the word permanently in there because that's a different category. These men they're not going to be able to work like they used to before the war. 15 million men are wounded. And again, most of these are young working men, so maybe they can work some job. But if they're permanently disabled, would be like they're missing a limb, they're blind, that kind of a thing. Well, you still have 15 million men who are wounded, and they need to be taken care of. All of these people need to be taken care of that are permanently disabled or even wounded. So this is called the lost generation. They're just just look at those numbers, just huge numbers of men in Europe that are just gone or can't work or something like that. So it results in this. It results in a loss of employment or workers. Obviously, if they're dead, they're not working, to state the obvious. But 7 million permanently disabled. Again, if you're missing a leg and you're a farm worker, you're not going to be out there plowing the field. You're not going to be out there baling the hay or taking care of the cow. You're going to be permanently disabled. So losing employees or workers, loss of land and properties. Again, this is Europe in bankruptcy. There's portions of the land that was given to France from Germany, and that land was maybe good for resources for France, but Germany loses it. So there's these effects on loss of land and property. Rebuilding was an impossibility because, again, especially in Germany, Germany was just destroyed financially. Even though there was no real war in Germany itself, the actual trenches of the Western Front were in France and Belgium. But the blockades, the boycotts and the blockades, no natural resources really getting into Germany. They depleted their resources. They couldn't bring in resources. And so you have people really, starving. You have factories with no material to build anything. So it's just rebuilding was an impossibility. It led to mass poverty, and then one of the big things here with the economy, it led to mass printing of money with no backing. And what that does, it causes inflation. And if you don't understand what that means, inflation, any monetary system that is based on a paper money, like we'd have in the United States with the dollar bill, there has to be something that is giving that paper dollar value. You can't just say, well, this paper dollar is worth something. There has to be something behind it to say its value. So let's say it's $1 paper dollar in your hand is worth one ounce of gold. Okay, so now that paper dollar is worth that ounce of gold. So if you start just printing money, or just printing all of this money, and you're outstripping what the backing is, then that paper money is basically worthless. So you need more of that paper money to equal the 1 ounce of gold. So that's what we talk about the Federal Reserve. What is the backing of our money? And I'm not sure what it is right now, but if you take $1 in your hand and you go to the vending machine and you buy a soda for $1, really what you're getting is worth about 27 cents worth of soda. If you truly, let's say it's a soda can in the machine, and let's say our dollar's worth 25 cents really. So you put the dollar into the machine, you get 1 can of soda, 25 cents worth of soda. In reality, if it was a true $1 equals $1 worth of soda, you would actually get 4 cans of soda for your $1 because that would be if it was truly that amount. But because of inflation, our dollar's not worth $1. Our dollar's worth basically around 27 cents. I'm not exactly sure offhand. But I'm just trying to give you an idea what inflation means. So if you just continue to print money with no backing, that money is worthless. And that becomes critical in Germany here in a little bit. I'll show you a picture coming up that's just crazy. So post-war recovery in the United States. The United States emerged as a world leader and an industry leader. So the war didn't happen in the United States. It happened in Europe. So we have all of our resources, and we went into overdrive with the industry to provide for the war. Now, World War II we're going to go to total war in World War II, where the industry is turned over to everything military. So instead of making cars, they're making tanks. But in World War I, the United States comes out as a world leader and they're an industry leader. U.S. still had a good economy compared to Europe. There are still issues with the United States economy, but compared to Europe, it's way better. They still have factories, resources, the infrastructure is there. The late entry into the war, remember the United States joined the war in 1917, and it ended in 1918, so the United States was in the war a lot less time than the rest of Europe. That late entry meant fewer U.S. dead. Most of the soldiers who went over there, remember the song Over There, most of the soldiers that went over there to Europe to fight, they actually returned home. But in Europe, let's say in Great Britain, many of the soldiers that went from England to France to fight, many of them did not come home. So it just destroyed that generation. But in the United States, it wasn't so much of an effect. And there were technological advances in the United States. Some important events that take place in the United States in the interwar years. One was women's suffrage. During the war, many women had replaced men in the factories, and so their influence increased. I mean, you had women building armaments, you had women flying airplanes, testing and flying the airplanes that were going to go over to Europe. Women just taking more of a role because some men had left to go to the war, having more of a role in different areas of life. So on June 4th, 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed. It was ratified August 18th, 1920, and that gave the women the right to vote. Here's a picture in the 1920s of some women protesting for the right to vote. The United States, again, continuing. There was inflation, as I said, but not on the scale of Europe. But there was some inflation in the United States, which caused the rise in the cost of living. So again, if your money is not worth as much as it was, then you need to print more money so you can buy more things. Well, when you have, over time, when you have a product that is, the price is basically going up because the people that provide the product, they need to make money, so they have to raise the price, and you have to have more of the money to be able to buy that. Just cost of living goes up. That's why it's because of inflation that back in the 1960s you could buy a hamburger for 25 cents, but you go to McDonald's today and a hamburger's like, I don't know, $2 for a regular hamburger. And if you buy a Big Mac, it's like $5. It's because of inflation. 1919, the cost of living went up 15% in 1 year. That's quite a bit. So if everything, and that's going across the board. So if everything you purchase, let's say for groceries, was a price in the beginning of 1919, at the end of 1919, that same amount of groceries, it went up 15% for all of that. And that's just in 1 year. So imagine if that inflation continues year after year after year, then it's just going to continue to rise. So at the beginning of a year, it's a certain amount of money, but by the end of the year, it's even more. And if that goes across a decade, it's like you're paying double or triple for what it was. A loaf of bread was $1, and now it's $3. So that's what happens with inflation. Unemployment, soldiers returning home, that's a typo there, returning home got their jobs back, which meant women who were in the workforce now are out of the workforce, and they got the taste of working, so they would want to work, and now they're considered unemployed. Some soldiers coming back from the war, they couldn't get their jobs back, and so they were unemployed. There was also intolerance to immigration. Soldiers coming back would have been given preference for their job back, so the immigrant could not get the job, so they're unemployed. There was also still intolerance to African Americans. It's still a segregated society in the United States. One of the big things that takes place is that there were African American army units fighting in France, and they return home, and in all rights, they're heroes. Some of them. There was a unit called the Harlem Hellfighters from New York City, an all-black unit that fought in the First World War, and they did some great things during the battle, especially during the battle of it's the Second Battle of the Marne. They were heroes. I mean, they did some heroic things. Well, they got awarded the Croix de Guerre, which is the highest. It's the highest award given by the French Army. It would basically be like the Medal of Honor, but it was only given by the French Army because the United States wouldn't give the Medal of Honor to an African American. So these guys come back to the United States after the war, and basically they should be treated as heroes, but they weren't. There was intolerance, and a lot of African Americans were unemployed. Veterans, African American veterans, were unemployed, and many of them, unfortunately, they went into poverty. Some of them went into drinking, and it was just not good, the unemployment situation in the United States for soldiers coming back, especially African Americans. There was the race riots of 1919, was a pretty significant event in that 1 year. Again, this is 1 year after we basically helped win the war. So you would think that the United States would be all united and we're in this together. No, there were 20 significant riots in the United States. The biggest one was the Chicago race riot of 1919. Here's a picture of, in the 1920s, of a black man is being yanked off of this, it looks like a trolley, being yanked off the trolley during the race riot. What happened was, basically, if you just want to know a little story behind the Chicago race riot, what happened was there was a beach on Lake Michigan, and it was segregated. And what happened was this young black man, youth, he went swimming in an area that he was not supposed to be swimming in. It was designated for whites. And so a bunch of white youth stoned him while he was in the water. They threw rocks at him while he was in the water, and he ended up drowning. And so they knew who the person was that dealt the deadly blow, and the police would not arrest him for murder. And so when the police refused to arrest him for murder, there are riots that take place in Chicago, and actually more than that across the country, but in Chicago. And the riots ended up killing, it was like somewhere around like 20 whites were killed, and like 35 blacks were killed in Chicago because of these riots. Okay, continuing on with the United States, there were strikes. This is in regard to working conditions. The Red Summer of 1919, 3,600 strikes take place across the United States, protesting the rise of inflation but not rising pay. So again, if the bread maker needs to purchase supplies, and his supplies are the cost of his supplies are rising and because of inflation, and he's got to increase the price of his loaf of bread because it cost him more money to make that loaf of bread, well, that means pay has to go up also. You can't just increase the price of bread, but the person whose money is not worth as much, they can't buy the bread. And so because of inflation but not rising pay, there were a lot of strikes that take place to protest the lack of pay. Prohibition, 1920 to 1933. That's when the manufacture and sale of alcohol was banned by a constitutional amendment, and then it was overturned by another constitutional amendment in 1933. It was basically viewed as a solution to the nation's poverty and crime. But really what happened was it led to other problems. It led to the rise of organized crime. So then you start thinking of the mafia and just organized crime within the cities. The rise of speakeasies, which were basically underground bars where they obviously there was drinking there with prohibited alcohol, but they would also have dancing, music. It's called a speakeasy. The rise of gangsters. So this would be the time of like Bonnie and Clyde gangsters. Political corruption in a city. What better way for a mob or mafia leader to be able to continue his criminal activity than by paying off politicians or paying off the police. And so there was political corruption in the cities, and then there was violence, murders, all of that. Here's a picture of some sort of police officer or someone who's enforcing prohibition. They're smashing barrels of liquor. Continuing in the United States, the Roaring Twenties from 1920 to 1929. This was the Roaring Twenties was a cultural phenomenon, cultural change that basically it was kind of a let loose type of an idea. Again, before the war, a very traditional type of society in Europe and even in the United States, where women were in the home, men were in the workforce. The men would protect the family from the worldly ideals. Those that were involved in all of the alcohol and the loose living, prostitution, all of that stuff, those were like on the fringes of society. After the war, when everything was being questioned, authority was being questioned, after the war, what happens is it's just kind of this idea of let's just enjoy ourselves. And so forget the world's problems, go out and have fun, enjoy yourself. There was mass consumerism and materialism. Again, you still have inflation going on, but people they were just buying all kinds of stuff, wanting to have the best fashions. All of this is going to come crashing down with the stock market crash in 1929. But during this decade, it's just let's have what we can get. Mass changes in lifestyle and culture. Women were no longer just I'm going to be in the home. They are now going to be out having fun, dancing, enjoying life. To enjoy yourself with little money, many people built up high debts on credit, which again, they're not going to be able to pay, which means credit companies, banks are going to have all kinds of problems coming up. People were increasing gambling establishments, went through the roof, and people were gambling away whatever money they had. Some people decided to invest in the stock market, and that became an increasingly popular way of protecting your money, was investing in the stock market, especially for corporations, and believing that it was a safe bet. But hint, hint, this is all going to come crashing down. Here's some women's fashions during the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties. Before the war, coming out of the Victorian era, women were viewed as having to be protected. Everything about the woman had to be protected. Her life had to be protected. Her virtues had to be protected. Definitely her femininity had to be protected. Obviously, sexuality had to be protected. And so in the Victorian era, you had women with, they wore very high collars. I mean, almost up to the under their chin. Their collars, they did not show any skin of the arms. They would always have gloves on, or like high gloves that would go all the way up their arm, or their dresses, their sleeves would come down almost to the middle of the hand. Their dresses would go well down past their ankles, even to where they were almost like brushing the floor, and women would wear high-laced boots under those dresses, so it was almost like nothing was seen of the woman except like the face and the hands, and even the hands would have gloves on. Very little makeup would have been worn. They would use powder to powder their face, but very little makeup would be worn. During the Edwardian era, it kind of relaxed a little bit, but it was still there. They would have these large hats on, usually adorned hats, feathers on their hats, something like large hats. And if you want to maybe just get an idea, just in something today, if you watch the early versions, early episodes of Downton Abbey, which takes place in England, that's how they would be dressing. A lot of them would be in subdued colors also. That would be a good representation if you watch the beginning episodes of Downton Abbey. Now, if you want to see the change that takes place during the 1920s, you can look here on the screen here. This is in the United States, and these women their dresses are not so much of the flapper period, but they are definitely a lot different than the Victorian and Edwardian period, especially in England, where you have shoes that you can see their feet, their legs, ankles, all of that. It's not like laced up boots. Their dresses considerably shorter. I mean, it's still conservative. I'm not saying it's, compared to today, it's definitely conservative, as you can see the dresses past their knees. But back then, this was very risque. This was like, wow, you can see these ladies' legs. Especially, look at the cursor here. Especially here, you can see that there's nothing up around the neck. You have more of a plunging neckline of their dresses. Okay, their hats. Now, this was a different style, so their hats weren't these big hats that had feathers and all of that in it. But you still have a hat. But this would be the clothing that women would wear out in public in the 1920s. It's just a great social change that takes place. Okay, so post-war recovery, I'm just going to switch gears real quick and put a note in here about Japan. I'm not going to talk about Japan very much, but just this one slide, but it's important because of what caused Japan to go into war in World War II. And it's kind of like this, their recovery wasn't as good. Japan's role is prime importance in World War II. What happens is Japan during World War I was an ally to the Triple Entente, so they were an ally with the Allies, and that's during World War I. And they were used by the Allies to secure the sea lanes in the Pacific and the Indian Oceans against the German power. So Germany had some colonies over there in the Pacific Ocean, and the Japanese were used to protect those sea lanes and basically cut off any kind of German colony. However, after World War I, their economy suffers because really the entire world economy was suffering. But their economy suffers, and they kind of turn into themselves. And they're almost like isolationists during the 1920s and 30s, except during the 30s they do realize they need some resources. And so they go to war, and they go against China, and they go into Manchuria. And that then develops more and more to where they need more resources and more resources. So now, especially oil, and so they want to then expand into the Pacific. And that's where, obviously, we get into World War II. End of absolutism in regards to the empires. During the 1920s, we see some serious change in Europe. Obviously, because of the loss of the war, you have, for the Central Powers, you have the collapse of four empires. First, you have the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire. They lost the war, so they collapsed. The Russian Empire collapsed in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, and we'll see that here in a minute under Russia, but their empire collapses. The Ottoman Empire also, that collapses. Remember, the Ottomans were involved down there with Gallipoli. Well, at the end of this, they collapse. The Ottoman Empire was known, before the war, was known as the sick man of Europe. That was the Ottoman Empire. Well, finally, the Ottoman Empire ends up dying. It breaks up. So you get Turkey. The country of Turkey develops. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrates. So that's the first one up here on the screen, is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Well, that disintegrates here, and it disintegrates down into this. And this is kind of important, especially for World War II with Hitler, especially with Poland. So when it disintegrates into these countries. And so you have the country of Austria, which is just south of Germany, and it's very small compared to what the empire was. You have Czechoslovakia. You have Hungary. They develop into their own country, Hungary. You have the states of the Slovenes, the Croats, and the Serbs. Now, that would form into what is going to become the country of Yugoslavia. Okay, but right now, right after the war, it's these different states. And then you have the development of Poland. Poland is given its own land, and it becomes a country after World War One. Now that's going to cause a big problem for Hitler. Here's a map of post-World War One Europe after the solidification of these countries. So here's Germany. It's called the German Reich or Weimar Republic. We're going to get to that. The Weimar Republic. And this little piece of blue up here, that's Germany also. Okay? And this is Poland. And you see this little pink spot that goes up here to, up in here. You see, it's called the Danzig Corridor because the city of Danzig is there, and that belongs to Germany. Well, what that was for was to give Poland access to the ocean. Well, what happens is it cuts off these Germans. These are ethnic Germans up here, and the reason it's cut off is because the Danzig Corridor. Now, remember, all of this used to belong to Germany, but they lost this area here after World War I, and that's Hitler is going to have a big problem with this. He uses this as a political thing to unite Germans with Germans and all this. He goes into that. We'll talk about that coming up later, but this is going to be a big problem, and all it is because they just drew lines on a map, and it's supposed to have like some kind of peace. It's through the peace agreement, but it ends up causing war. Czechoslovakia, that used to be part of the German. Part of this was German. Part of it was Austro-Hungarian Empire. But now it's Czechoslovakia. You have Austria down here. You have Hungary now is now its own country. This here is the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which that's going to turn into Yugoslavia later. You have Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. All of these used to belong to Russia. But after the Bolshevik Revolution, they develop into their own countries. The Ottoman Empire is gone, and now you have Turkey. So you see all of these different areas being cut up, all in a peace agreement. But it's going to lead to war. Another interesting, which we're going to talk about coming up here in a minute, is the development of Ireland. Ireland was part of Great Britain, but they have a civil war, and you have Northern Ireland, and the basically the Free Ireland, and so you have, and this is still today. Okay, so you see it kind of breaks off Northern Ireland right there. Okay, so things are not going to end up well, obviously, with the Second World War coming. End of absolutism for Germany. Germany's post-war condition, economically devastated, millions are dead, depleted resources, collapse of the Kaiser. Okay, Kaiser, that means king in German. Collapse of the Kaiser, and the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, which we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. Germany's great humiliation. They had to accept the war guilt clause of the Treaty of Versailles, which basically said that Germany had to take responsibility for the war, and that's not going to fly with Germany during the interwar years, especially with the rise of the Nazis, where a lot of the Nazis, early Nazis, belonged to groups or organizations called the Free Corps, and they were adamant. The Free Corps were adamant that it was not Germany's fault that the world went to war, and so they would fight in the streets. They were armed. I mean, it gets really crazy. We'll talk about some of this coming up during the rise of the Nazis. Huge war reparations to France and Great Britain. Again, they couldn't pay that. There was no way they could pay it, but these huge war reparations were put on them. They were limited in military size based on the Treaty of Versailles, and again, Germany was a very militaristic nation. I remember Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck, very militaristic. They went into the war armed to the teeth, and then after the war, they had a very limited military, and it's right here. They were limited to 100,000 man army, which is very tiny compared to what it was. I mean, it was millions and millions of men that went to war, and now you can only have 100,000 men. Volunteers only, okay, so it means you can't draft anyone, so no conscription. No armored vehicles. I mean, how can you have an army, especially a more modern army with no tanks? No modern vehicles, no submarines, no aircraft. I mean, these were main ways that the German military operated during the war. I mean, obviously armored vehicles, but the submarine warfare was going on, and their aircraft. I mean, you think of the Red Baron story with the biplanes. There was definitely World War I air battles going on, and so now they can't have any aircraft. they were limited to 6 battleships, and they were not allowed to have any troops in the Rhineland, which is a portion of Germany that borders France. And so they were not allowed to have any military in this area that is called the Rhineland. And that is going to be a big deal for Hitler, because when Hitler comes to power, one of the first things he does is he sends soldiers into the Rhineland. Here's a picture of the dismantling of a tank. Now, what is interesting is that this is a British tank. This design is a British tank, but it was captured by the Germans during the First World War, because you see they have this is German markings on the tank, and that happened. Sometimes they would capture the tanks in battle, especially if a tank broke down on the battlefield, and the Germans could go and take that tank. The Germans had their own tanks, but the Allies had more of them. And so if a German unit was able to capture an Allied tank like this and make it their own, that was definitely a benefit for them. Now, this is after the war, and they're dismantling the tank. Okay, let's flip over to Russia now. Russia was an absolute monarchy until 1905. So it was just a king. They're called the Tsar. Tsar is king in Russian. Transitioned to a constitutional monarchy under the Tsar, so it had a constitution, but still a monarchy. But then in 1917, which was during World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution takes place. And during this, basically the Tsar is taken out of power, and then permanently the last Tsar is taken out of power on July 17, 1918. The Tsar Nicholas and his family are executed by Bolshevik revolutionaries. The Bolsheviks were led by Vladimir Lenin. Probably heard of him before. They took power of the government, and they became dedicated to making it a socialist state, which will become communist. All right, so here's Tsar Nicholas and his family. This is an early photograph, probably early 1900s. You can see the clothing of the era. Okay, every single person in this picture is killed in the basement of the palace by Bolsheviks. This is where they were killed. This is a room in the basement of the palace. The Bolsheviks stormed the palace. At night they rip the families out of their beds. They take them to the basement, and when they get to the basement in this room, they're executed right here in front of this wall. Now, this wall has been taken apart. See these holes? What they were doing was investigators came in and were looking for where the bullets if the bullets were lodged in there. So the wall was taken apart. But this is where the family was executed. So every single one of these people in this photograph was killed right there in this basement room. Okay, so end of absolutism, unstable democracies. Okay, so what takes place? There's economic failure in Germany in 1920, and the Great Depression in 1929 basically destroys Europe's fragile economies. Ethnic tensions in some states caused instability. Defects that are written in new constitution allowed for changes that allowed authoritarian rule. For example, emergency powers given to a leader. And we're going to see that coming up in the next lecture with Mussolini. What happened was some of these constitutions, to include the Weimar Constitution, allowed for, especially prime ministers, to have emergency powers given to them, which basically, it was a limited emergency powers. It wasn't forever. It was like they would be given emergency powers for 6 months or for a year, which basically they could become a dictator for a year. And that has great impact, especially during Hitler's chancellorship, because Hitler is elected. Everything Hitler did was legal to get to power. He was elected, and then he was appointed as chancellor, which that's how the Constitution was written up. The winning party would appoint a chancellor, kind of like the prime minister. And the prime minister would then have these emergency powers. And so all you had to do was have some kind of crisis to have that leader become a legal dictator. And that's exactly what takes place. So that's a defect in the Constitution, to give one man emergency powers to become a dictator. No real leaders developed in many of the countries. Therefore, their new democratic governments were very weak. During the 1920s, you really don't hear of many names around Europe who become these great leaders that lead these new democracies. Most of them are just kind of flim-flam leaders. They're in and out. I mean, the number of governments that are created and dissolved underneath of these constitutional democracies, it's insane. Especially Weimar Germany. Weimar Germany is the name of the government during the interwar years for Germany. Very weak. Okay, so we'll talk about that here. Germany's Weimar Republic was between 1919 and 1933. So remember, the Second Reich ended with World War I, and the Third Reich begins in 1933 with the Nazis. So this time period is called the Weimar Republic, and it's named after Weimar, Germany, where the first constitutional assembly takes place. It was a very weak government. They always had to call for elections because the government would have to dissolve the governmental body, and they would have to call for new elections. I mean, all the time they were calling for new elections. They couldn't get anything done. It was very unpopular with the people, especially German World War I veterans. Again, the World War I veterans, especially in Germany, but very disillusioned. Why did we go fight? And now we're so weak. They were very nationalistic, and now we have this really weak government. It was plagued with hyperinflation. So not just inflation, but hyperinflation, which we'll talk about. Constitutional issue. Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution allowed for emergency powers to be given to the president, but it never precisely stated what situations the president could have those powers. And that's definitely going to come into effect with Hitler, because basically what happens is there's a fire that takes place in the Reichstag, which is the building. The Reichstag is the government, but it's also the name of the building where the government would meet in Berlin. And the Reichstag catches fire, and so Hitler is given these emergency powers, and he never loses them. He remains in charge. Germany's economic crisis, they did not raise taxes to pay for the war. Instead, what they did was the government just printed money. And like I said earlier, you can't just print money without a backing, and that's what they did. In 1914, $1 US was worth 4.2 marks. In 1921, $1 US is equal to 64 marks, and in 1924, look at just the time period, 3 years later, $1 US is worth 800 million marks. And so just to give an idea of this, compared dollars to marks, let's say in 1924, you needed to buy a loaf of bread and it cost $1 US. Okay? You would need 800 million marks to buy that same loaf of bread in Germany. But they didn't have that kind of denominations of money. So what happened was they were printing their marks in their regular denominations. And so what happened was people needed to go buy a loaf of bread. They would need a wheelbarrow of money, of marks, to go buy a loaf of bread. And I am not joking. They literally needed to carry suitcases of money to buy a loaf of bread because of this hyperinflation. What happened was it gets to the point where the money is so worthless. Instead of using the marks to go buy firewood, they would just burn the marks in their stove instead of the wood because the money was so worthless. There's stories of women going to the factory at noon and getting their husband's pay for the day at noon because by 5 p.m. the money would be worthless by 5 p.m. So they would go to the factory at noon, get all the money that they could from their husband's paycheck, and then go buy bread or go buy meat or whatever they could buy with it, because by the time the evening comes, the money from their husband's paycheck at noon wouldn't be able to buy the meat. That's how fast the inflation takes place. It's just crazy how the society can't even function. So what happened was they developed the Dawes Plan, which was formulated by Charles G. Dawes, who was a U.S. banker, and he was actually the 30th vice president of the United States. He developed a plan to help Germany pay for their reparations. And in this plan, it was to help try to curb the inflation. He was given the Nobel Peace Prize in 1925. Here's a picture of children in Germany playing with money. And this is what I mean by having to carry the money around. Again, they didn't have a paper bill for 800 million marks. So you had to actually have 800 million marks to buy $1 worth of bread. And so these kids are playing with the stacks of money as if they're building blocks and just out there playing, building a tower with the money. It was worthless. There's another picture, I don't have it here, but another picture of a bank book with banknotes in it. Basically, it's like kind of like almost like a checkbook, but instead you would tear the marks out of the bank book and pay for it. They're using the bank book as like a steno pad, as like a notepad to write notes on it. Dawes' plan continued. It was a loan from the U.S. to Germany for 800 million marks, which is backed by gold. And so what I mean by that is that it doesn't sound that much if 800 million marks is worth $1 US, in the hyperinflation scenario. Now you have 800 million marks, which is backed by gold, and so that's a lot of money. 800 million marks truly backed is a lot of money, and so this was to help get Germany back on its feet. And what they did was they then set their war debt at a set amount of 20 billion marks, which would be put on a payment schedule. And so it's to help Germany get back on its feet. They still had to pay the reparations, but it was being paid now with money that was backed by gold, and they have a set amount, 20 billion marks. It set a war payment schedule in an attempt to stabilize the currency, but of course it failed, especially with the stock market crash in 1929. Germany failed to keep up on the payments, and then that means that France and Great Britain got upset and were threatening Germany. But by this time, the Nazis were beginning to rise, and then the Nazis they weren't going to pay anything. Great Britain, three main issues. First off, soldiers. So many were killed in it's an island nation, small compared to the United States, small compared to the mainland Europe, but still almost 1 million men killed, which devastated families, devastated communities because of the PALS battalions. I'll just explain that really quick with the PALS battalions. When Lord Kitchener in World War I was raising his army, or the armies, what he said was that instead of men coming into the army and just being put into units, more people would join the army if they could join with their friends. And so they're PALs. That's what it's called, the PALs battalions. Basically, it was battalions, which is around 1,000 men. A battalion is like 4 companies of men. So about 1,000 men could join up, and they could all be friends. They could all be from the same town. They could all be from the same county, same area of the city, and they wouldn't be separated. So they would join up as friends. They would go through training at being, as friends, and then they would go to war as friends. And what happened? They would all go out and die as friends. And so these PALS battalions went off to war from the same area. Many of them killed, especially during the Battle of the Somme. So many men were killed during the Battle of the Somme that these communities were completely devastated. Entire senior classes of high school, graduated high school, joined up together and were killed. The entire senior class was killed. So it destroyed communities, it destroyed the workforce. 2 million wounded, would need medical services. 40,000 plus lost legs and arms. So they needed taken care of. So that caused great strain on Great Britain. 1921, the second issue was the establishment of the Irish Free State, because Northern Ireland remained loyal, so the Irish Free State. And then you have the collapse of the aristocracy. Again, before World War I, you have strong aristocracy. You had these vast estates. The lord would have a vast estate, would control would control towns, would control the farms, all of this. And now you have the collapse of the aristocracy. Here's a picture of the war wounded. You can see these men, they're missing their legs. You know, who's going to take care of them? Who's going to help them? And that's it for part 1 of the interwar period. I know it's a long
class. That's it for today. Next time we'll be looking at part 2 of the interwar years. I'll see you then.